Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in this world. God bless you. This is Gloria White coming to you from Utah, USA. Today we're going to be in the Halley's Bible Handbook, and I had started to read Leviticus, but and I got part of the way in, but I'm just going to start at the beginning of it again because it's like I said, it's 5 pages long, and I'd like to keep it all together. Leviticus. This includes the sacrifices, the priesthood, holy seasons, and various laws. The word Leviticus means pertaining to Levites. That is, the book contains the system of laws administered by the Levitical priesthood under which the Hebrew nation lived. These laws were given mostly at Mount Sinai, with additions, repetitions, and explanations throughout the wilderness wanderings. Levites, one tribe out of the 12, were set apart for the work of God. God took them in lieu of the firstborn sons. God claimed the firstborn both of men and flocks. They were supported by tithes and had 48 cities. And you can find that in Numbers 35:7 and Joshua 21:19. One family of Levites, Aaron and sons, were set apart to be priests, and the rest of the Levites were to be assistants to the priest. Their duties were the care of the tabernacle, and later the care of the temple, and to be teachers, scribes, musicians, officers, and judges. And you can check that out in 1 Chronicles 23. And now we're going to break the book of Leviticus down into chapters. Chapters 1 to 5. Various kinds of offerings. Burnt offerings of bullocks, rams, goats, doves, pigeons were wholly burned, signifying entire self-dedication to God. Meal offerings of grain, flour, or cakes without leaven. A handful was burned, the rest was for the priest. Peace offerings of cattle, sheep, or goats. The fat was burned, the rest eaten, partly by priest, partly by offerers. Sin offerings and trespass offerings. Different offerings for different sins. Fat was burned, the rest, in some cases, was burned without the camp, or outside the camp, and in some cases eaten by the priest. Where wrong had been done to another, restitution, with a fifth added, had to be made before the offering. Chapters 6 and 7. Further directions about offerings. Besides the offerings mentioned, there were drink offerings, wave offerings, heave offerings, appendages to other offerings. The manner of sacrifice. The animal was presented at the tabernacle. The offerer laid his hands on it, making it his representative. Then it was slain. The blood was sprinkled on the altar. Then the specified part was burned. Frequency of sacrifice. There were daily burnt offerings on the first of each month, additional offerings, and at feast of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, and on Day of Atonement, and special offerings of various kinds. Chapters 8 and 9. Consecration of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood. Previous to the time of Moses, sacrifices were offered by heads of families, but now the nation organized, a place set apart for sacrifice, and a ritual prescribed. A special hereditary order of men was created in solemn ceremony for the service. Aaron and his firstborn son, in succession, were high priests. The priesthood was maintained by tithes of the Levites, tithes and parts of some sacrifices. 13 cities were given to them. You can find that in Joshua 21:13 through 19. The high priest's garments. Every detail was specified of God. That can be found in Exodus 28. A robe of blue with bells at bottom. An ephod was a sort of cape, 2 pieces joined on the shoulders, hanging one over front, one over back, with an onyx stone on each shoulder, each bearing 6 names of the tribes, made of gold, blue, purple, scarlet, and fine linen. A breastplate about 10 inches square, of gold, blue, purple, scarlet, and fine linen, double, open at the top, fastened with gold chains to the ephod, adorned with 12 precious stones, each stone bearing the name of a tribe, containing the Urim and the Thummim, which were used to learn the will of God. But what they were is not known. The sacrificial system of divine origin was placed of God at the very center and heart of Jewish national life. Whatever its immediate applications and implications may have been to Jews, the unceasing sacrifice of animals and the never-ending glow of the altar fires, beyond doubt, were designed of God, to burn into the consciousness of men a sense of their deep sinfulness, and to be an age-long picture of the coming sacrifice of Christ, toward whom they pointed and in whom they were fulfilled. The Levitical priesthood was divinely ordained as a mediator between God and the Hebrew nation in the ministry of animal sacrifices. Those sacrifices were fulfilled in Christ. Animal sacrifices are no longer necessary. Christ himself is the great high priest for man, the only mediator between God and man. Hebrews 8, 9, 10 makes this very clear. Chapter 10. Nadab and Abihu. Their swift and terrible punishment was a warning against high-handed treatment of God's ordinances, even to church leaders who distort the gospel of Christ with all kinds of human traditions. Chapter 11. Clean and unclean animals. There was a distinction before the flood between clean and unclean animals. You can find that in Genesis chapter 7, verse 2. Moses enacted this distinction into law. It was based partly on their wholesomeness as food and partly on religious considerations designed to serve as one of the marks of separation of Israel from other nations. Jesus abrogated the distinction. You can find that in Mark 7:19, making all meats clean. Chapter 12 is the purification of mothers after childbirth. The period of separation in case of boy babies was 40 days, and in case of girl babies, 80 days. The purpose of this is thought to have been to help hold the balance of sexes, as men, by exigencies of war, were subject to greater fatalities than women. Chapter 13 and 14. Test of leprosy. These regulations were for the purpose of controlling the spread of one of the most loathsome and dreaded diseases. Chapter 15. Uncleanness. The elaborate system of specifications as to how a person could become ceremonially unclean, and the requirements concerning it, were, it seems, designed to promote personal physical cleanliness and continual recognition of God in all the ways of life. Chapter 16 is the annual atonement. This was on the 10th day of the 7th month. See page 148. most solemn day of the year. The removal of sin was only for a year. You can find that in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 3. But it pointed forward to eternal removal. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 4, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 13, 1, and Hebrews 10:14. Scapegoat is translated in RV as Azazel, which is thought to have been the name for Satan. After the sacrificial goat had been offered, then the high priest laid his hands on the head of the goat for Azazel, and confessed over him the sins of the people. Then the goat was led away into a solitary land, bearing away the sins of the people. This ceremony was one of God's historical forepictures of coming atonement for human sin by the death of Christ. What else could it mean? Chapter 17, Manner of Sacrifice. The law required presentation of animals at the door of the tabernacle. Eating of blood was strictly forbidden. And you can see that in doesn't give me the book. Let's look in Genesis 3:17, 7:26, chapter 27, chapter 17, 10 through 6, and Genesis 9:4, Deuteronomy 12:16, 23 through 25, and still is Acts 15:29. Chapter 18, the Canaanite Abominations. If we wonder that some of these things, incest, sodomy, cohabitation with animals, are even mentioned, it was because they were in common practice among Israel's neighbors. Chapter 20 and chapters 19 and 20. Miscellaneous laws about the Sabbath, idolatry, peace offerings, gleanings, stealing, swearing, wages, courts, tale-bearing, brotherly love, diverse breeding and planting, adultery, orchards, augury, marred beards, and flesh cuttings, harlotry, respect for the aged, kindness to strangers, just weights and measures, Moloch worship, sorcery, parents, incest, sodomy, animals, clean and unclean. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Chapter 19, verse 18. This was one of the highlights of the Mosaic Law. Great consideration was shown to the poor. Wages were to be paid day by day. No usury was to be taken. Loans and gifts were to be made to the needy. Gleanings were to be left in harvest fields for the poor. All through the Old Testament, unceasing emphasis is placed on kindness to widows, orphans, and strangers. Okay, so here the next section is concubinage, polygamy, divorce, and slavery. They were allowed but greatly restricted. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 19:20, Deuteronomy 21:15, Deuteronomy 24:1 through 4, and Exodus 21:2 through 11. Moses' law lifted marriage to a far higher level than existed in surrounding nations. Slavery was hedged around with human considerations, and it never existed on a large scale among the Jews, nor with such cruelties as were prevalent in Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome, and other nations. Capital punishment. Offenses punishable with death were murder, and you can see that in Genesis 9, chapter 9, verse 6, Exodus 21:12, Deuteronomy 19:11 through 13. Kidnapping, Exodus 21:16, Deuteronomy 24:7. Death by negligence, Exodus 21:28 and 29. Smiting or cursing a parent, Exodus 21:15 through 17. Leviticus 20, verse 9. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21. Idolatry, Leviticus 21 through 5. Deuteronomy 13, Deuteronomy 17, 2 through 5. Sorcery can be found in Exodus 22:18. False prophecy, Deuteronomy 18:10 and 11, and Deuteronomy 20. Deuteronomy 18, verses 10, 11, and 20. Blasphemy can be found in Leviticus 24, verses 15 and 16. Sabbath profaning can be found in Exodus 31:14. Adultery, Leviticus 21:10 and Deuteronomy 22:22. Rape can be found in Deuteronomy 22:23 through 27. Anti-connubial immorality, Deuteronomy 22:13 through 21. Sodomy is in Leviticus 20, verse 13. Animal cohabitation, Leviticus 20:15 and 16. Incestuous marriages, Leviticus 20, verses 11, 12, and 14. Next section. These laws were the laws of God. Some of them are similar to the laws of the Hammurabi, with which Moses, no doubt, was well acquainted. And though Moses may have been influenced by his Egyptian training and by Babylonian tradition, yet over and over he repeats, "Thus saith the Lord," indicating that these laws were the direct enactment of God himself. Some of them may seem severe to us, but if we could transport ourselves back to Moses' world, they probably would not have seemed severe enough. On the whole, Moses' law, in its insistence on personal morality and personal equality, and its consideration for the old and young, for slave and for enemy, for animals and its health and food regulations, was far purer than rational, humane, and democratic and showed a wisdom far in advance of anything in ancient legislation, Babylonian, Egyptian, or any other, the moral miracle of the pre-Christian world. Moses' law was designed of God as a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ in Galatians 3:24. Some of its provisions were accommodations to their hardness of heart, Matthew 19, verse 8. Chapters 21 and 22, Priest and Sacrifices. An explanation of the provisions of chapters 1 to 9. Priest must be without physical blemish and may marry only a virgin. Sacrificial animals must be without blemish and at least 8 days old. Chapters 23 through 24. Feast, lamp, shewbread, blasphemy. Feast, see on Deuteronomy 16. The candlestick must be kept burning continually, the shewbread to be changed each Sabbath, blasphemy to be punished with death, the eye for eye legislation and that's in verse 24:19 through 21, was part of civil law, perfectly just. See Matthew 5:38 and Luke 6:27. Chapter 25, Sabbatic Year, Year of Jubilee. Sabbatic year was every 7th year. The land was to lie fallow. No sowing, no reaping, no pruning of vineyards. Spontaneous produce was to be left for the poor and the sojourner. God promised enough in the 6th year to carry over. Debts of fellow Jews were to be canceled. Jubilee year was every 50th year. It followed the 7th Sabbatic year, making 2 rest years come together. It began on the Day of Atonement. All debts were canceled, slaves set free, and lands that had been sold returned. Jesus seemed to regard it as a sort of picture of the grand jubilee which he came to proclaim. Leviticus 25, verse 10, and Luke chapter 4, verse 19. Ownership of land. The land of Canaan was divided among the 12 tribes, and in the tribes among families. With certain exceptions, it could not be sold in perpetuity out of the families. A sale amounted to a lease till Jubilee, when it would be returned to original family. The number 7. Every 7th day a Sabbath. Every 7th year a Sabbatic year. Every 7th Sabbatic year was followed by a Jubilee year. Every 7th month was especially holy, having 3 feasts. There were 7 weeks between Passover and Pentecost. Passover feast lasted 7 days. Tabernacle feast lasted 7 days. At Passover, 14 lambs, twice 7, were offered daily. At Tabernacles, 14 lambs, twice 7, daily, and 70 bullocks. At Pentecost, 7 lambs were offered. For more information, we could see page 688, which we won't do that now. But if anybody wants to know what that is, put a comment down in the description or in the comment section, and I'll read it up. Chapter 26, Obedience and Disobedience. This chapter, like Deuteronomy 28, of magnificent promises and frightful warnings, is one of the great chapters of the Bible. Chapter 27, Vows and Ties. Tithes can be found in Genesis 14, verses 20, 28, and 22. Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 through 32. Numbers chapter 18, verses 21 to 28. Deuteronomy 12, verses 5, 6, 11, 17, 18. Chapter 14, verse 23, 28, 29. And chapter 26, verse 12. 1/10 of the land of the increase of flocks and herds was to be given to God. 3 tithes are mentioned: Levitical, festival, and for the poor every 3rd year. Some think there was only 1 tithe, and that it was used partly for festivals and every 3rd year partly for the poor. Others think that the festival tithe was taken out of the 9/10 left after the Levitical tithe had been paid. The tithe was in use long before the days of Moses. Abraham and Jacob paid tithes. Among the Jews, the tithe was for the support of Levites, and Levites were used in civil government as well as in religious service. See on 1 Chronicles chapter 23. The first fruits. God claimed as his own not only the tithes, but also firstborn sons of all families, in lieu of whom he accepted the tribe of Levi, the firstborn of all flocks and herds, and the first fruits of the field. The first fruits of the harvest were to be offered at Passover, and no part of the new crop could be used till this was done. And that can be found in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 14. The first crop of a young orchard, the 4th year, was to be given to God, and no fruit of it could be used till this was done. Lesson: make God first in life. And that concludes the breakdown of the Leviticus chapter. And as always, I love you.